I like to think that my kids are smart and talented and capable. I'm really proud of them. And very likely, most of us would say the same things about our own children. We're happy when they do well, and we're pleased when they begin to thrive in whatever field of endeavor they've chosen. And nobody is prouder of a son or a daughter than a mom or dad can be. And yet, as proud as I am of my kids, none of them at 7 years of age was ready for any significant responsibility. Let me say it even more clearly. None of them was ready for leadership. But there's a story in the Old Testament, in the book of 2 Chronicles, about a 7-year-old boy who not only became a leader, he became a leader of an entire nation. His name was Joash. Some of you have heard of him, some of you maybe haven't. But the reason he became king in the land of Judah was because his entire family had been destroyed, and he was the last surviving heir left who would normally ascend to the throne. And there was an incredible spiritual decline in the land. There were evil people in charge, and he had been hidden away in a place of safety as those who would seek to kill him were doing just that. And finally, a priest, a godly man by the name of Jehoiada, decides it's time for the rightful king to become king. Even if he is 7 years old, we need to follow the order that God has laid out. And he brings Joash to the throne, and he installs him as king, and a revival begins in Judah, a restoration of the worship of the true God. You see, up to this point, the temple in Jerusalem had been reduced to ruins. It was not being used, and it was completely non-functional. Whereas the worship of false Canaanite gods was everywhere, especially the worship of Baal, the central Canaanite god. But Joash comes to the throne, and under Jehoiada's influence, things began to change. And let me read to you where the beginning of this Reformation comes. It's in 2 Chronicles 23, and it's in verse 16. Here's what it says. Then Jehoiada made a covenant between himself, the people, and the king, that they should be the Lord's people. And at that point, the people of Judah go down and they tear down the worship of Baal, the false Canaanite god, and they begin to restore the worship of the true God in the land of Judah. And at that point, it was mostly Jehoiada's leadership. In fact, he was making the decisions, and the people were really following him because, again, you don't follow a 7-year-old. But then Joash begins to grow up, and he becomes a young man, and he also decides that he wants to be part of this restoration of the worship of the true God. And so he leads the movement to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and that's him who's wanting to see it happen. And they gather all the materials, and they bring in the construction specialist, and they rebuild the temple. And God blesses that as well. And you would think that it would continue that way throughout the reign of Joash. He had shown himself to be someone concerned about the worship of the true God. But something happens. I want to read to you what happens in 2 Chronicles 24, verse 15. But Jehoiada grew old and was full of days, and he died. He was 130 years old when he died. Now, Joash has already proven himself to be a man of God. And yet even godly men without the right spiritual influences speaking into their lives are susceptible to the wrong influences. And here's what happens, verse 17. After the death of Jehoiada, the leaders of Judah came and bowed down to the king, and the king listened to them. The idea here, and I'll read more in just a second, the idea was they began to flatter him. They began to show their obsequious behavior. Oh, king, you're the best. Here's what we think you should do. And they convinced him to do something. Here it is, verse 18. Therefore they left the house of the Lord God of their fathers and served wooden images and idols. He believed them because they flattered him. And he allowed the reintroduction of false worship. And of course, God judged them. Joash goes into battle. He's beaten soundly. He's seriously wounded. He comes back to the land, and his own servants conspire to attack him, and they kill him. What began so well winds up in tragedy. Here's the point I want to get at. We all have people who influence us. In some cases, we have what you would call mentors. There are people that we purposely seek out for counsel, for advice, for wisdom, and we do our best to follow what they say because we believe it will help us. In most cases, we don't have someone you'd call an official mentor. Most of us, however, simply absorb certain values from people that we're around. Whether it's what they emphasize that we're hearing, whether it's the information they share with us that we're receiving, whether it's somebody we're talking to face in person, or whether it's somebody that we're watching on TV, but we watch them on a regular basis. We all have people who speak into our lives and who influence us. Here's the question I want to ask you. When you think of the people who influence you, what kind of effect do they have? When you're done talking to them, are you filled with fear, or are you filled with faith? Are you filled with peace, or are you filled with anger? And that list could go on and on. The people who influence you leave a lasting impression. And the Bible would say, choose wisely. Choose carefully. Find godly people to speak into your life, because they will leave the kind of lasting impression that will be a blessing to you, and you in turn will be a blessing to others.